Hello, everyone. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie, and I am really excited to introduce a guest to you who I will be spending today's episode talking to and also next Monday's episode. Hello, Bryson Ensign. How are you today?
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm great.
Good, good. I am so excited to have Bryson here on our show. And I am going to well, first of all, let me tell you who he is and why he's here. And then I'm going to tell you why I'm so excited to talk to him. So, Bryson is a gentleman who has taken special interest in the Latter-day Saint missionary, the full-time missionary. And he has taken such an interest in this that he has put a great deal of time and energy into creating mental health resources for them. And I'm being kind of very vague on this because this is the topic of the next two conversations. So, Bryson is, you're near and dear to my heart because I was actually looking through all of his content. I'm just giving y'all a little reason why this is meaningful to me before we jump into it. And it occurred to me, like, why am I feeling so many big feelings about this? And it occurred to me that, for one thing, of course, I am a return missionary. That was a very, very pivotal time of my life. As many, if not most of you listening know, Nathan and I have a full-time missionary ourselves. Our son is currently in 2026 serving a mission. And also, it has occurred to me that I feel a bond of connection with any young couple going through medical school and residency because that was such a, I don't know, significant and challenging time in my life and in my family's life. So to know Bryson through I met Bryson just recently, but I knew his wife first because she was in one of my earlier growth and processing groups. And I had just such a tender place in my heart for her because she was a young mom with two small children and a husband in medical school. And it felt like looking at myself in the mirror from 20 years before. And I didn't even know that this is what Bryson was doing. I had no idea if he was somebody who was a supporter of the Latter-day Struggles podcast. I had no idea about any of this. And then his wife reached out to me a couple months ago and said, "Hey, my husband's a listener and he's doing something special. And I think it might be valuable to your listeners." And so I learned a little bit more about it. And that brings us up to this moment in time. So once again, Bryson, welcome, welcome. Tell us, if you would, a little bit about your relationship with Latter-day Struggles and kind of a bit about your own faith journey, just so that the listener kind of understands who you are from that perspective, like as a fellow traveler on the Latter-day Saint faith expansion experience.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of mental health. As a psychiatrist, that I live and breathe mental health and helping people learn how to thrive. There's a lot of people who struggle out there, and I really value teaching tools and helping people develop the skill set to be able to overcome their challenges. And so that's sort of my professional background. I've been in residency the last 3 years. I'm about 7 weeks from graduating or moving on from my adult training, and I'll be moving into a fellowship starting in July to work with children, so a child and adolescent fellowship. And so I love mental health, and also I love spirituality. And so it's a topic near and dear to my heart. I have been listening to Latter-day Struggles really since its inception, from the first few weeks it came out, just that intersect between mental health and spirituality and how to navigate both. And so that's how I got involved listening to Latter-day Struggles. And I just love listening to the guests that you have on and hearing your thoughts on how to navigate faith and how to navigate mental health and a healthy relationship with both. So just a little bit about my personal journey is, yeah, I served my mission about 12 years ago. I served in Africa, and I came home and I struggled. I had a lot of experiences on my mission that I think I came home a little scarred. And I loved my mission. I wanted to say that. And I also want to say that I think the mission really helped me in many ways. But at the same time, my mission also impacted me in not so healthy ways. And coming home, I struggled a little bit with scrupulosity and some anxiety and how to navigate the dating scene and just losing my autonomy on a mission to go from Bryson to be just elder for 2 years. I really struggled trying to navigate developing a self once again. And that I think played a role into my spiritual life as I developed using the stages of faith model from that stage two to stage three, I started asking questions and looking deeper and developing spiritually. My relationship with the church changed and trying to figure out how to navigate that in a healthy way as well. And so that's sort of been my process, and listening to Latter-day Struggles has been a big help in that.
Thank you for that. Would you say, as you have both engaged in a spiritual health journey and a mental health journey, was that what kind of interested you in moving into your specialty in medicine? Seems like it must be connected.
Yeah, it definitely plays a role. I love, yeah, as you know, with medical school, you kind of the world is your oyster. You can choose between a lot of different specialties. You can do primary care like pediatrics or family medicine, or surgeries, or psychiatry, ophthalmology, etc. And so, just through the process of medical school for those 4 years, I rotated through all the different specialties. But then I did a rotation in psychiatry at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. And during that time, I was meeting with a lot of preparing missionaries, return missionaries, and missionaries who had come home early because Utah State has a lot of that population. And so I started to see a lot of those struggles and the reality of mission service interconnecting and intersecting with mental health. And that really was the beginning of my interest in helping missionaries with mental health. And then, kind of in that same vein, I just fell in love with psychiatry. I started reading books. In my own time outside of work, I was listening to podcasts, and I just found it fascinating. And that's when I knew that psychiatry was my calling, is when I was doing it for fun.
I definitely get that. Something I want to just ask you about before we jump into the work itself or the program that you've created is I've been really thinking a lot about your conversation. So, little aside to you all listening is Bryson and I, of course, got together and talked about how we wanted to spend our time together on these couple of episodes. And something that Bryson mentioned that I very much resonate with is that this is a topic that if you are in or around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, uh, anywhere on the spectrum of faith, this likely touches you in some way. And I would love for you to just speak into that a little bit more, if you would, Bryson, because I think just based on a lot of factors, how Mormonism is so deeply a part of our identity as individuals, but also our community identity. No matter where we personally are, this impacts us, and so I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's so valuable. So say a little bit more about that, if you would.
Yeah, it's hard to escape the topic of missionary work in and around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's just everywhere. And whether you look backwards, so for example, one of my ancestors is Orson Hyde, and he went on a mission to the Holy Land and spent years traveling the globe and then dedicated that land. And so you hear that in your family history. And then in the present, you have nieces and nephews, you have brothers and sisters, you have aunts and uncles, your parents even who are serving. And then in the future, as you raise your kids, you're saying, are they going to serve a mission? How can I prepare them? And so, in and around the church, missionary work affects the past, the present, and the future. And whether you're fully in the church or on the edge, inside of the edge, or fully out, I think missionary work is a sensitive topic that can touch everyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that is extra relevant for listeners to the Latter-day Struggles podcast, because as I often say, and I just continue to notice over and over again, those who listen to the Latter-day Struggles podcast and who participate in any place on my platform have traditionally been very devout themselves and often ironically find themselves on a really, complex faith journey with a missionary child like ourselves, like me and Nathan, or many, many of you who listen and who are in my growth and processing groups have parents on senior missions. That is not uncommon at all, trying to negotiate how to be in connection with and in relationship with loved ones like that. And as we will probably talk a little bit more about later on, there is a lot of need to process some pretty complex feelings about the Mormon mission ourselves. For so many of us, and myself included, my mission was foundational in a lot of really fantastic development, personally and spiritually, and also it was problematic. There were problems there. And I think this is such a great place to negotiate the beauty of complexity, that like where we are developmentally, if you like stuff like what we're talking about in generally on Letter of Struggles, you know that like it's life is complicated and we don't shy away from that at all. And so if I may, I'd love to have you start talking to us a little bit about what your program is. Tell us what what it's named, who it serves, what resources it offers. So I might kind of just raise my hand every once in a while, Bryson, and just pause you to like maybe ask a question or two. But I would, by and large, like to kind of just let you go and share with us exactly what it is that you offer, because it's just a treasure trove of amazing resources. And I was looking at it, y'all, and I was kind of like, how did this person do this while in medical school and residency? Like I was a little bit blown away by that. And it did occur to me that you clearly had uh, divine help walking you through this to help you accomplish what you've been doing while also so very busy in other important endeavors professionally and personally. So I'm just so excited for you to share this with all of us.
Thank you. It's definitely been a labor of love. It's and a small and simple steps. It has taken a lot of time, a lot of effort, mostly an hour here, an hour there when I put my kids to bed or on a weekend or between patients. So it's really just, yeah, I've had these thoughts come, and it really has been over a series of years that I've built Latter-day Missionaries. So going back a couple years, it really started when I was doing my rotations at Utah State University and in Logan, working with those missionaries and those return missionaries. And I kept having that thought, someone needs to do something to help these missionaries. And I had that thought for a while, for years really. And then at one point it came to him, he's like, I have the skill set to help these missionaries. I have gone through medical school, I've been in residency, I have now been trained and I'm qualified. And I just needed some boost to get me to that point where I was to begin. So I'll share that story a little bit later. But I first wanted to start talking about the why. Like, why is mental health and missionary work so important? And so, as I built Latter-day Missionaries, I did a lot of research. I interviewed current missionaries, I talked to return missionaries, preparing missionaries, I talked to family members and past mission presidents and mission leaders. And almost across the board, everyone's like, we need a resource. We don't have enough support. I'm struggling. And the ubiquitousness of that is just astounding. Everyone that I talked to is like, yes, we need this. And that to me just speaks of how important mental health is and maybe how unaddressed it is on missions. When a return missionary comes home, they'll often talk about how it's the best 2 years of their life in their homecoming talk, but not often do people talk about the struggles. And so one of my hopes with Latter-day Missionaries is to hold that complexity, that missions can be amazing growth experiences and they can be very complex and difficult and heart-wrenching, and how to learn to navigate that complexity.
Something that I'm thinking about, Bryson, is that if we or as we resource missionaries like your platform does, they can take those positive growth oriented experiences and they will exponentially uh, help them, because they won't be sort of mired down by lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, or what can't be achieved in terms of one's thriving because of the lack of resources that that most missionaries experience, right? In other words, imagine the missionary experience with your Latter-day missionary resource and how much more positive a missionary experience could be if they're not struggling with scrupulosity, with shame, with ignorance around emotional intelligence. I mean, the sky is the limit of what they are capable of. And so I'm just such a fan of what you're doing.
And broadening the scope outside of missionary work, my goal is to have missionaries come home with a full tool set that will launch them into life. So, into marriage, into careers, into professions, that they'll have these skill sets that they learn when they're young that will carry with them through the rest of their lives.
So this is clearly kind of the gift that keeps on giving. And my understanding is that it is designed to meet the needs of the pre-missionary, the missionary, the post-missionary, and the families of the missionary. So it's very broad in its scope. Say more about that if you would.
Yeah, it's really the whole mission experience. It started off with the pre-missionary. They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I spend most of my days every day trying to help people heal. And so I'm like, what could we do to help minimize the negative and the trauma and the issues? And there's a lot of things outside of our control, but there's a lot of things we can learn and the skills to navigate. And so that's really how the Mental Health Training Center was born. And so the Mental Health Training Center, the MHTC, as I like to call it, is designed for preparing missionaries. It's 12 lessons and it covers a series of topics I'll dive into a bit later. But it talks about stress and navigating homesickness and dealing with difficult companions, and then teaches practical research backed skills and tools that they can take with them on their missions. So it's designed to be taken in the weeks to months before missionary service. Ideally, it will be taken one per week, and that way they can apply what they're learning and implement it before moving on to the next topic. But if a missionary is leaving next week and needs a crash course, they can watch all 10 or 12 courses, and it's about 10 hours. And so I intentionally created a lot of handouts and workbooks that they can take with them. So they can, if they're struggling, they can go to their Google Drive on their P day and print out one of the handouts or workbooks. So if they're struggling with panic attacks or anxiety, they can download a workbook on breathing exercises and mindfulness. And so it's this tool set that they can take with them. So when they are struggling, they know what to do and have the resources to address it.
Yeah, I was so impressed by the breadth of the information that is in your, what did you call it again? Remind me.
The Mental Health Training Center.
Okay, so that is so clever too. Yeah, MTC, and he just throws an H in there, the MHTC. So I caught it. I suspect you were thinking, oh, I wonder if, people are going to catch this, but I was like, oh yeah, that's so clever. So he takes these topics that sister and elder pre-missionaries can go through. And man, this is the thing that was I probably why I find myself so resonating with this is I was thinking with our son who is currently on a mission, if we had had this resource 6 months before his mission and we could slowly work through it with him, it would have been so valuable, not only just for him, but for other siblings, for ourselves. It would have given us language because where Nathan and I were in that space right before our son's mission, we were kind of aware of like, okay, we're having a complicated, like, we were feeling complicated about the whole thing for like obvious reasons. Uh, but there were parts of us that were like, okay, is it really like, is the most important thing going through Preach My Gospel with our son? And quite frankly, I didn't think it was. Like, I wanted the resources that you are providing us around emotional intelligence, around understanding how to have a challenging conversation with somebody that maybe I'm not getting along with, around being courageous, around homesickness. Like these are the things that like fundamentally I cared about as the mother of a missionary that I didn't exactly have language for until I read your overviews and parts of like I watched some of the videos and then I read through all of the descriptions, and it really does cover pretty much everything that a missionary could use and could call upon, from the very emotionally oriented to what some people might consider quite pragmatic, like how to eat healthy, how to get enough sleep. And that is fundamental to one's mental health, no matter who you are. Sleeping, diet, exercise, emotional connection, meditation. You hit on all of the pillars of mental health. And so I really, really love that. Carry on, if you would, in talking about some of the, I guess, take it whatever direction you want. We were talking about objectives, um, how these will help missionaries. Just go. I'm going to just turn it back over to you, Bryson. I don't want to be too directive here.
Yeah, for these preparing missionaries, the goal is really to start the conversation. It's not the end all be all. And so, like you said, moms, dads, parents, it's hard to say, okay, let's sit down and talk about the attributes of Christ the next lesson and preach my gospel. They'll get that in mental or in mission prep on the ward or stake level. They'll get that in young women's and young men's. But what the conversations are typically lacking is, how do we manage stress? What does stress look like for you? And what tools can you do when you are highly stressed to regulate? And so that's really the topic of lesson one. In lesson two, it's all about homesickness. And the research shows that 70% of homesickness can be prevented. That's something we don't hear in Sunday school, that there are practical tools that we can learn to develop a skill set to navigate homesickness when it comes and to reduce it so it doesn't come at all. And then as missionaries, you're with a companion 24/7. Like, they're with you everywhere you go. They have to stand outside the door when you're in the bathroom. I was thinking about this the other day, that there's really no other situation like that except maybe prison, when you have someone watch like with you all the time. And I think that's telling. It's very difficult to navigate. And it's difficult at any stage, but it's hard as a teenager. Like as an 18 or 19-year-old, this is challenging stuff. So that's what we talk about in lesson three. And then, as you mentioned, I have two lessons I call the language of emotions. And so, how to name your emotions and tame it. So, and how to say, I am feeling, and putting a name to it can make a world of difference as a missionary. And so the emotions I focus on after talking to lots of missionaries was comparison, because comparison is such a big thing on missions. You're comparing numbers, you're comparing baptisms, you're comparing what you look like, how your language is. So that's a huge topic that missionaries struggle with. Another one is cognitive dissonance. So sitting with that complexity of, I have this belief, but my mission president wants to do that. Or I'm teaching the plan of salvation to this family whose father is an abuser. How can I navigate that? And so there's a lot of dissonance in your cognition or thought process as a missionary. And that's just a part of healthy living, is learning how to navigate that we talk about in the Mental Health Training Center. And then we have a whole lesson on shame. So many missionaries deal with shame. I'm not talking like big moral shame where you go home from your mission. I'm really talking about kind of the day to day, where guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad. A lot of missionaries internalize this. I'm not doing enough. I'm not exactly obedient. Therefore, I am bad. God will not bless me. I will not have the miracles promised because of what I did. So, very transactional, um, unfortunately, in missionary work, that we see that induces a lot of shame. And so, those are the three big emotions we talk about in that series. I honestly love this mini series about the language of emotions. I'm really passionate about it and believe all missionaries will benefit from learning how to talk about their emotions more. And then we have a couple lessons, like Valerie mentioned, on what I call the mental health fundamentals. So on moving, on eating, on breathing, and sleeping. So I talk about very practical approaches to how to navigate sleep. For example, in my mission in Africa, the donkeys neighed, the roosters crowed all night long, the parties were going, and I really had trouble sleeping. Like, I wish someone told me I could have brought a white noise machine. or even brought earplugs. And so I kind of go to that level of practicality, or an eye mask, or things you can optimize your sleep. And then with the healthy eating, I have a whole work cookbook that I designed with some return missionaries of how to do quick meals that are healthy that missionaries can do. And then the movement, exercise is so important, but most missionaries are so exhausted, they walk all day. And so having I have 4 months of exercise routines that they can do in their allotted 30 minutes if someone wants more guided direction around that. And and then I have a whole portion on how to navigate mindfulness and breathing. And yeah, I try to err on the side of practicality. I recognize that these are 18-year-olds who just barely graduated their math class and are excited about going to Portugal or going to Florida. And the last thing on their mind is thinking about potential anxiety or stress. And so I try to teach these skills and be practical about it, keeping in mind the audience. And then I have a lesson on rejection. As you know, being a missionary is hard. There are a lot of rejection, whether that you're walking and people spit at you, people slam doors, people set their dogs on you, people call you names, people throw rocks at you. I think all those happened to me on my mission. And rejection can be devastating. And how to navigate that with a healthy mindset rather than internalize that shame of I am bad, people hate me. And then I have a couple lessons on the most common mental health conditions that missionaries face. So I did a lot of polls and research with return missionaries and found that 34% of missionaries in my sample struggled with symptoms of depression on their mission. That's about 10% higher than their age population outside of missionary service. So it's higher. Same with anxiety. About 30% struggled with significant anxiety symptoms, which also is about 10% higher than the average population from 18 to 25. And then about 14% struggled with OCD or scrupulosity symptoms, which from a general standpoint with that age group, it's about 1.4 to 1.5%. So that's a significant, huge increase in symptoms of scrupulosity in missionary service. So thankfully, in our next recording, we'll talk about in detail scrupulosity and potentially why that is on missionary service. And so that's kind of an overview of the Mental Health Training Center. There's, like you said, I dive deeply into each of those topics and with the hope that it just starts the conversation. Parents can talk to their missionaries, they're preparing missionaries about these things and like, hey, this week let's pay attention to anxiety. Let's practice these tools as a family. Or maybe they're at college, you can have this phone discussion long distance, like, hey, I watched this video, you watched it, let's talk about it on Sunday and talk about ways I've dealt with cognitive dissonance in my life and how you might face that on your mission. So really it's to get the conversation rolling, to start preparing missionaries to think about it and have the resources when they face it on their mission.
Something that I am really, really impressed with and struck by as I listen to you and think about how you have put this content together, Bryson, is that it feels to me that no matter where a missionary or their family is on the spectrum of faith, this would be not only just valuable but palatable. In other words, this isn't something that a devout person, a parent would be like, "Oh no, this is a little too edgy for our family," right? Or if you are like myself and Nathan, who are deep into a faith journey and have very unorthodox beliefs and thoughts about the church, but still feel very much a bond to it as our home tradition and where our son is serving. It's so valuable for us for our own reasons. And we can sort of take the content, as could a very devout family, and it could be really deeply meaningful, just used maybe in slightly different ways, right? In other words, a more devout family might be interested in, like, oh, this is interesting, this cognitive dissonance thing. It may not resonate as much if they don't feel very much of it. Whereas a family that is in a more complex space on their faith, their faith experience may really focus on that. But it, to me, seems like it's quite a skill set and a gift to be able to create something that has relevance and is applicable to everyone on the Latter-day Saint faith spectrum in and around. And I mean, almost impossible to do. And it feels in some ways like you've done this thing. What are your thoughts on that, Bryson?
Yeah, it took a lot of intentionality.
Yeah,
This wasn't easy, especially knowing that my population was also 18-year-olds.
yeah.
So that adds even a more complexity. So I had to keep it short enough. I have a break in the middle. I do a mindfulness in the beginning. So for our kinesthetic learners, I try to keep it active. For those who have ADHD, I try to keep it focused, and I give them the written handout so they can follow along as they listen. So I try to target specific learners and whatever conditions or learning styles that they have. And then going back to kind of stages of faith, I also was intentional about the audience because we'll have the true and blue all in families or missionaries, and those who are single parent families who have not as much support, or those whose parents have left the church. It really provides a foundation for everyone. And yeah, not all lessons will resonate with everyone. I like to tell my patients that, you might respond to this tool or you might not. The goal is to figure out what works for you. And so that I intentionally provide a lot of tools, knowing that not all of them will work for everyone. So just for an example, I had a return mission president go through the course to get feedback from his standpoint. And he's more that true believing. He gave missionaries or his son's advice that if your mission president tells you to jump, you ask how high, like that kind of mentality. And so he actually struggled with the the lessons on cognitive dissonance and especially on shame. His perspective was like shame should be between a mission president and the missionary, but his mind jumped directly to worthiness interviews. And so I had to respond and say, hey, this is broader than that. We're talking about the day-to-day emotions, not the big ones. And so we had agreed to disagree on that topic. But surprisingly, as I get feedback, specifically the sister missionaries, shame is their favorite lesson. And it resonates with them and it speaks to their soul. Because I think so many missionaries and preparing missionaries, especially the sisters, struggle with shame. And so I just share those two juxtaposing examples between the mission president and a preparing sister that, yeah, some of the material will resonate with you, some of them won't. And I talk about that. I process that in the videos that it's okay to disagree with what I say. Like you will disagree with your mission president, you will disagree with your investigator friends. And that's part of the process of spiritual maturity and mental maturity is that you learn how to disagree without being disagreeable and how to navigate difficult conversations.
I really loved how a lot of like kind of interspersed throughout your curriculum was this explicitly inviting families or missionaries to uh, to be like it's okay to be uncomfortable. Like if this is new, if this is different, if this makes you feel a little bit itchy because you've never heard of it before, or maybe they come from a family that isn't like comfortable talking about mental health issues, or even may see a mental health issue as sort of a spiritual shortcoming, right? I mean, I think that's less in the zeitgeist than it used to be, but I think it's still out there with devout families that, like, depressed people are somehow not living the gospel well enough or something like that. And so you are inviting a broadening of understanding around some issues where some families may be very comfortable, some kids may have their own therapist, there may be a lot of resourcing, and with some, there may not be any at all or some discomfort. And you're saying, that's okay, which I love because it is modeling a broadening of one's perspective, right? It's inviting discomfort, which is, I think, such a great invitation into what a missionary hopefully will be learning how to do, like anyways, on the mission, right? This idea that they will be confronting more complexity, hopefully, in a different environment with different people, with having to be 24/7 with people that may or may not be our cup of tea exactly. And so you're kind of almost like setting them up for more complex experiences. Anything you want to say about that? Because I have something to tag on to that, but I just want to make sure if you want to follow up, I want to give you the chance to do so.
Yeah, there's two examples. For example, a missionary will open preach my gospel and they'll read the quote that obedience brings blessings, exact obedience brings miracles. This can be true, and it can also be devastatingly difficult for someone suffering with depression. And then they'll turn the page and they'll read the quote from President Hinckley where he was struggling and his father writes him and says, "Forget yourself and go to work." This is great advice as you're adjusting to missionary service, that adjustment period. You're overwhelmed as you immerse yourself in the culture and the language. That is a great advice. And if you're struggling with significant anxiety or OCD, forgetting yourself and working and not paying attention to your emotions can be devastatingly harmful. And you have to sit with that complexity. And unfortunately, a lot of missionaries don't have that complex side. They just hear that you have to be exactly obedient. And then they struggle in silence for their whole missions and then come home not okay. And so those are just two examples where sitting with that complexity can be very helpful.
It occurs to me, and my hope is that as this curriculum spreads far and wide, which is definitely my hope, because I think it's so valuable, that it will position at least listeners to this conversation who are on a, kind of a faith expansion experience that if you have a child uh, that is serving a mission or someone that you care about over whom you have influence, that you can be helping them have the critical thinking skills to recognize and even like work with these, a young person on two things. For one, the assumption, I guess, needs to be that in the case, I'm just going to use my own family. Our son wanted to serve a mission. Of course, this was not something that was obviously pressured on him. This was something he felt very strongly about. It actually has made it's been a complication in our family in some ways because of the timing. But because he wanted to serve a mission, it was like, how can we help him as best as possible manage in an environment that may in some ways be not conducive to mental health? And this is a portion of our time together, Bryson. I think it would be good for us to just be very candid that in some ways, what are what our young people and others are exposed to in full-time missionary service is not the most mentally healthy way of seeing the world. In other words, we're talking about transactional relationships. We're talking about sometimes cultures of shame. And that's not every mission, right? There can be some missions, and I have heard of them, where there are just really strong, foundationally mentally healthy principles taught from the mission president down. And I've also heard the opposite, where I am like stunned by some of the shame-based, fear-based, you know this it's been around for a long time because I still hear it from my son is this whole like obedience and fear orientation around reaping the blessings of heaven and things like that that really put a lot of pressure on young people. And I think that's directly correlated to exactly what your findings are around anxiety, around depression, around obsessive compulsive, especially with sort of the scrupulosity. And so, what I hope is happening is that we can position people whom we love and over whom we have some influence to say, okay, you can go into this environment and there are so many potentially growth oriented things that can happen. And also, I want you to have some awareness that there are going to be some things that you're going to hear, or some environments, or some even like ways of seeing the world that are not in that. Like, I want my kid to be able to like sniff that out and say, I'm not going to participate in a shame culture or the highly competitive worthiness culture. And so, if we can help them see it's going to be there, it's in some ways the occupational hazard of an institution that does run very much on sort of a capitalist business model and help them be able to have a complex thinking, enough skills to be able to derive the benefit that can come from this sort of hero's journey like experience, while also not being weighed down by or wounded by some of the more toxic potential things that can happen in a mission. Thoughts on that, Bryson?
Yeah, exactly. The church doesn't release data, but from what I've gathered through 70s comments and state conferences that have been recorded and documented, and just in my experience, from what I understand, about 15 to 30% of missionaries return home early. And that number fluctuates at given periods or quarters or years. Um, but a lot of that, the majority of that actually, from the studies I've read, is not worthiness issues, but mental health concerns. And if this was a company and 30% of your employees are leaving every year, we don't say, what is wrong with the employees? We say, what is wrong with the system? And I truly believe that there are some systemic problems that worsen mental health. We'll talk about this in the next podcast with scrupulosity in particular, but there are some things in the system that kind of roadblocks or danger signs that can worsen depression, that can worsen anxiety, or OCD, or instill shame. And I'd love to start the conversation that, especially from a family level, to have parents and they're preparing missionary to say, hey, these are some potential roadblocks, and give them the language and the permission to say, if you are struggling, I'd love to talk to you about it. It doesn't mean you're faithless. It doesn't mean you're disobedient. It means you're human. And I want to hear what you're struggling with. And I'm here for you. I can't fix it, but I can be there for you. And just having that space can make a world of difference in mental health and spiritual health.
It occurs to me that perhaps what has been embedded in some of us, especially when we are in that more devout era of our faith development, that any mention of struggle or doubt or anything that might be perceived as weakness, and oftentimes I think from that very binary perspective, weakness is not considered normal and human, but it's considered some sort of reflection on myself or on my faith in God. And so for us to be explicitly speaking into how that is a false belief, that is a false tradition of our fathers and mothers, and this and that this is something that we can be talking about, so that these loved ones of ours are not, first of all, picking that up and integrating that into how they see the world, and then sometimes having that very thing deeply reinforced in a mission culture. And so the way I sort of see what your work is, Bryson, is, and forgive me for being a little dramatic here, but I joke around from time to time that I my definition of prophets has changed, and I see prophets all over the place, and prophecy and the ability to see a need to help humankind and to meet it is what prophecy is to me, and that's what this is. So, as a mother of a missionary, thank you.
Yeah, so many missionaries struggle. I hear story after story of missionaries who are struggling with depression and open up to their mission president, and their mission president, not knowing whether they're a farmer or a banker or whatever their background is, they send them to the farthest part of the mission, isolate them, and say, forget yourself and go to work. Or the missionary who's having suicidal thoughts and tells their father, and they say, I'd rather have you come home in a body bag than come home early and shamed. Or the sister who's struggling with anxiety and she talks to a therapist in Salt Lake, which is great, but the therapist recommends she takes a warm bubble bath and engage in self-care but forget she's in Africa and there's not warm water or baths, just bucket showers. There are so many missionaries who struggle with significant mental health on their missions, but also on when they come home. And I think this is the unspoken language of missionaries is you put your best face forward and say, I am the Lord's voice. I can't look like I'm suffering. And then you come home and it's like, I have to show I had the best 2 years because this is what's expected of me. And so you don't process the emotions. Everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people, return missionaries, have nightmares about being called on their mission again. I know I did for many years, and a lot of people do. And dreams aren't the end all be all, but I think it speaks to kind of the collective trauma, I'll use that word, of the difficulties and the complexities. And so it is my hope through Latter-day Missionaries that we can create a cultural change. I'm in the cheap seats, I can't change the system, but from the bottom up, I believe I can help missionaries learn to have a voice and learn to have the tools to say, hey, I'm struggling. I'm going to implement this and let's do it together.
What you're reinforcing that I just love so much is that I think you and I could probably um, speak into the general level, and I don't want to oversimplify this or make it too broad because it's probably not across the board, but I think it's I think it's fair to say that the church is in general sort of in an uncomfortable position with mental health issues. Um, right now, mental health workers seem to be the target audience of the church's greatest anxiety. And a lot of that, I think, is in part because developmentally, so many members of the church are actually growing and starting to become more critically thinking. And that is placing a higher degree of threat around the church's ability to manage the narrative. And in some ways, it's some of the more multi-generational members are evolving at a rate slightly quicker than the institution knows what to do with. And to that end, I do believe that the some of the call, the inspiration falls to people like you and me, Bryson, who has deep care for our primary language of faith and those whom we love and care for in the faith or negotiating the faith in specific moments of their development, such as in this particular case, the Mormon mission. And so light and truth is, in fact, being restored, awakened within us in this tradition through unsuspecting guides and leaders that don't happen to be speaking at General Conference, twice a year. In unassuming places, in your small office in the Midwest, or where, when I work in my downstairs little office, like we're trying to help loved ones respond to their own spiritual awakening if and when they're ready. And we are not for everyone, right? Like there are people in earlier stages of faith where traditional General Conference Mormonism is doing the trick for them. But there are others who are trying to negotiate this in very unique situations. And in the case of Latter-day Missionaries, they can either find themselves unresourced and potentially in harm's way when it comes to their own mental health, both in the mission, but also the impact that this can have on the rest of their lives. Or with a resource like yours, they can take this experience, which has potential to be growth oriented, and it can amplify their depth, their emotional intelligence, their complexity, and they can continue to negotiate their spirituality in the mission, but actually also throughout the rest of their lives as they choose how to broaden their spirituality in the context of of their Latter-day Saint heritage in a more sort of creative, adaptive, and psychologically and mentally healthy way. And so you are setting people in a direction towards, I think, like the most adaptive spirituality. They can take this really intense experience of the mission, which it is, and you can say, okay, we can like see how this goes and see what, kind of unmitigated trauma happens or what emerges because so many mental health issues actually emerge in the late teens, early 20s already. It's almost like there's a vulnerability there, anyways. Then you can put them into a situation that is highly stressful, very unfamiliar, and sometimes things really do sort of, they can spin out. Or you can prepare them and you can say, okay, I'm going to give you all of these resources so that you can take this intense experience and grow from it because you are resourced. And this is almost like a sandbox for your potential growth and development. And we're going to be here with you, helping you so that you understand what's happening and you can use this as maybe one of the most growth oriented periods of your life. So I'm loving what you're doing. And I guess as we close, first of all, if you want to comment on what I just said, great. If not, close us up, Bryson, by maybe sharing a little bit about your personal call to this, why you've given so much of yourself. You could do so many things in psychiatry as a Latter-day Saint physician, and you've chosen this, and I think that's really special and lucky us. But I'd love to have you share a little bit about why this is personal to you.
Yeah, I love in prior podcasts, you often say healthy spirituality is healthy psychology, and vice versa. Healthy psychology is healthy spirituality. I truly believe that. Some people don't. They view mental health as a roadblock or even as a ram or a hammering ram that is trying to break down the church. I don't see it like that. I see that mental health will help missionaries be healthier. It will help missionaries be more spiritually grounded. It will help prepare them as they go through their healthy faith expansion journey and give them the tool set not to pull the rug under them, but to say, hey, I got this. I can navigate my relationship with my faith, with my church, with the scriptures. And so I see it as kind of all encompassing, that it's all together. When I mentioned at Utah Valley or Utah State University when I was in med school, I saw those return missionaries and I had that thought, someone should do something about it. So that percolated with me for several years. And I had that thought every couple months, like there needs to be some resources. But it was after I graduated medical school, moved to the Midwest, I started residency, and I was in my intern year. And as you know, intern year is the hardest, the busiest. I was working every week, every other weekend, so 12 days on, 2 days off. I was working 70, 80. I think the max I worked one week was 89 hours a week. So it's in this intense environment where you're seeing patients die, you're seeing the hardest parts of humanity. That I woke up at 3 a.m. Sorry. And at this time, sleep was very important for me. And I woke up at 3 a.m. and I heard a voice saying, the missionaries need your help. The missionaries need your help. I was exhausted raising two young kids, working so hard, and I just wanted to go back to bed. But I couldn't. So I got up. It was winter, is dark, it's cold. I went and sat in the dark in my kitchen, and I just had this flood of inspiration, I'll call it, of my higher power, where I had these thoughts of what the missionaries need, what topics, what big yield, high yield topics are they struggling with? And I wrote it down: stress, homesickness, dealing with comparison and cognitive dissonance and shame, rejection, dealing with the depression, anxiety, OCD, dealing with rejection. And in the hours of 3 to 5, I had the outline for the mental health training center. And then I had to put my scrubs on and go to the hospital. But to me, that was the beginning of Latter-day Missionaries, the call, so to speak. Um, I wish it was all that easy, that that flood of revelation, to quote President Nelson, that call to make a difference. But it's been a lot of work. I work a lot, and putting any time towards this has been very difficult. My kids have been patient, my wife, and it's definitely been a labor of love. But I truly believe that it will save lives. And if not save, it will definitely change lives to help missionaries set up for success, preparing for their mission, on their mission, and especially when they come home, to be psychologically and spiritually healthy throughout their lives after their missionary service.
Oh, I am just feeling deep gratitude for you and your willingness to respond to this call. And I'm just forever in awe of how beautiful it is to see the divinity of others awaken within them, to see unique calls that so many different people receive in different ways that create more and more and more light and beauty and goodness and truth. And it's just really, really fun to hear you and your story, to learn about how this came about, and to see how it's been unfolding. And I could not be more proud to share this on my platform for hopefully many, many people that will benefit uh, from this, because this is such a deeply needed resource, and it's in some ways bridging the needs, the mental health needs of a body of people that really haven't been, focused on in terms of their mental health needs. I mean, a little bit, we're coming, there's been a little bit of improvement here, but I am just deeply grateful for the work that you do. And so grateful that I get to be the bridge between you and families that will now have access to a resource that so many of us wish we had when we were out there serving missions, or when loved ones that were struggling and we didn't know what to do. And so to that end, I'm just endlessly grateful that I get to be a part of this work of connecting people with ways to become as psychologically and spiritually healthy as we can be. Now, next episode, I asked Bryson if he would be willing to walk us through one of the sections or chapters in his program, and I specifically chose the question of talking about. Is it scrupulosity that I asked you? I can't remember, because there were a couple that I was really wrestling with, because I kind of wanted to do two or three of them, but I think I landed on OCD and scrupulosity because, as he mentioned a minute ago, the statistical number of full-time missionaries that struggle with this is outrageously higher than the general population at their age. And so to me, that is something worth really slowing down and addressing. And I also, this is near and dear to my heart because this is something that is in my own family. And also, this is larger than just missionary work. It may be that, and I know this to be true, not from doing any sort of statistical analysis myself, but I have had many a case study of people whom I have worked with both in my groups and in my individual consulting, whose anxiety and scrupulosity sort of shall we say, heightened or kick-started many years of struggling on their full-time mission. Like, that was not unusual and is not unusual at all. And so that's so worth talking about and slowing down. And honestly, any of these topics, we could do one on every single topic, but we'll just do one so that you get the lay of the land on what each and every one of these lessons look like structurally. And then we'll also look at the content itself on OCD scrupulosity and how his work helps educate a full-time missionary, their family, and also gives them tools and resources on what to do so that they don't ever have to feel alone in this particular issue. And then we can also see how Bryson structures each lesson based on what we work through on this one. So anything you want to add as we close up today, Bryson?
I'm very excited to talk about our next topic. And I thank your listeners for joining in this conversation. And I hope it's a starting place where everyone can, regardless of your relationship with missions, missionary work, or even the church, that you're able to recognize that mental health is a huge component of missionary service. And I hope that this is the starting place where you can have these open, honest, and vulnerable conversations to help from the ground up make a cultural shift where it is okay to talk about struggles. It's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to say, I need help.
Beautiful, beautiful way to end. And I am so looking forward to our next conversation. And we will see you all next week. If you're interested in the resources that we're talking about, we're going to link that in the show notes of this podcast episode and the next one. So, and we'll give Bryson some time next time to talk about any more information about where to go and how to find all of these resources. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Bryson.
Thank you.
And we will see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.